There we go. All right. So today we're going to look at the history of the English translation of the Bible. So we've been working all the way up to this about the source documents in Greek and Hebrew and all that kind of stuff, and who picked the canon. No one did, everyone did, all that kind of stuff. So then this just specifically, once you have something to translate from in terms of the Greek, for instance, for the New Testament, then what's the history of the English translation that we have today? So that's all we're going to talk about. And it's actually pretty fascinating, and it's tied up with a lot of politics. A lot of people died. So we're going to create this chart a little at a time. Don't look at that. Okay. So time is vertical on what we're going to look at. We're going to build it slowly. So time is vertical rather than left and right. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with the source documents on the bottom. So we've got the Latin Vulgate on the left, which Jerome did in the 400s. Remember that. So that's actually a source document for a lot of the English translations that come up. And then what we spent so much time on, the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts in the original Hebrew and Greek language. And that little box on the left there, the TR, that's the Textus Receptus, which is what they call it. That's the very limited number of texts that they used for the first Greek translation in the New Testament. So it's a very limited, it's 6 documents, maybe 7, depending on how you count it. The rest of that bar on the bottom is on the order of 5,000 to 6,000. So it's just a very limited subset, because you'll see how that gets used as well. So we're going to build that picture historically of the English translation. So you start in 1382 with Wycliffe, whose name actually was acquired by a very famous mission organization that goes around the world and translates into native languages, the Bible, Wycliffe organization. So Wycliffe does it in 1382, and he does it completely from the Vulgate. So you'll see these little I don't know what you're on, columns. So he builds his English translation, which will all be in tan color with green around the edge, just completely on the Latin Vulgate. So he does his translation in English, first English translation, without looking at any Greek or Hebrew. He just does it on the Latin Vulgate, which was accessible, and that was the mainstream document for the church for eons and eons and eons until modern languages. So the Vulgate started like in 400s, 500s. It's not another 1,000 years, it's not the 1500s until you get modern translations. So the Vulgate was the thing, okay? So that was the source document for everybody for a long time. So Wycliffe does that in 1382. And Wycliffe had a really, what do you want to call it, controversial idea. His controversial idea is if you translated the Bible into the common language of man, they could understand it. Now, we talked about this before, about how that was heresy in the early church, because you have a modern clergy in the church at the time, and their only claim to fame as clergy is that they could read Latin, so they could understand the Bible. So they kept the laity at arm's length from Bible truth, saying, well, if you want to know Bible truth, rely on us. We'll tell you on Sunday mornings because we can read the Latin and you can't. So it was job security, largely. So that's what you get. So when Wycliffe said, no, I think if we put it in a modern language, people can understand it themselves, that was very threatening to the leadership of the church. So Wycliffe got in some hot water. But here's what he said about that common man understanding. He said, no man was so rude a scholar, but that he might learn the words of the gospel according to his simplicity. So it's kind of crazy English. But what he's saying is that no matter how simple you are, even if you don't read Latin, if you put it in English, they'll get it. To the level that you can understand it, you'll still get it. And that sentiment is shared by us today in modern translations. We say that, if someone can read it, you can get it. And the gospel is simple enough that the simplest person gets the core of it, but it's also deep enough that someone who's really intellectually horsepowered, you can go as deep as you want to go, but the simplest can get it, which is why Jesus says you have to be more like a child. Not childlike, but a child in terms of you can still get it. You can still get it. That's why we teach children the gospel, because they get it just fine. Amen. Okay, after this on the timeline, a couple of important things happen. 1440 or so, Gutenberg makes his printing press. So Wycliffe's Bible back in 1382 was handwritten. It was handwritten. There was no printing press at the time. So even though it was an English translation, it was a handwritten English translation. So Gutenberg comes out with his press. 1440 it arrives, and actually it's not until the next 50 years or so. By the time you get to 1500, they're printing stuff like crazy. So 1500 is the date that most people use for when the whole book industry starts, around 1500, because of Gutenberg's press. So And I don't know if you knew this, it's actually kind of a variation of a grape press. Did you know that? Because it's that big screw in that arm. You turn this thing and it presses this thing down. If you put grapes underneath there, it'll squeeze the grapes. So he just used that to press, paper against an inked bunch of characters. So that's anyway. So Gutenberg's press comes around in 1440, and then now there's something super important thing happens that we looked at already. Erasmus comes up with his printed Greek New Testament. For the first time it's actually been printed. And we wait until the third edition. The third edition, he sort of knuckles under to some doctrinal pressure from the church and includes things that he shouldn't include, like the marginal notes from 1 John 5, and some other stuff. But anyway, third edition is a really big deal when he does it. And this is actually, I looked hard, this is a picture of the third edition of Erasmus's Greek New Testament. And if you look at the right and left, you notice that it's a split page. It's bilingual. The right side is Latin, which was the accepted document of the Bible for 1,000 years, and on the left side is the Greek that underlies it. So it's the first time the Greek had ever been printed like this. So this is the printed Greek New Testament. Now, when that becomes available to a bunch of scholars in the early 1500s, that coupled together with Wycliffe's sentiment that anyone who reads it in the modern language will get it, they said, well, now we have a printed Greek text I can translate into English from that. So it turns out that this particular Greek translation, Erasmus's translation, is a super, super, super big deal, because that lit a fire for people doing modern translations into English and into German and into Dutch. I mean, it just lit a fire. So that's there. So that entire part, Erasmus's Greek comes just from the TR, from the Textus Receptus. So remember, it's a very small subset, maybe 6 documents of the original language that they had at the time. And if you remember back when we looked at that, it not only is 6 or 7 original language documents, but they're all penned from 900 to 1200 AD. So they're not very old. So you have a limited set of documents that are not very old. So that's what it's entirely based on. That's what Erasmus did his from. Okay, so then the next English Bible is Tyndale, and it's entirely based on the Textus Receptus, the subset of the old Greek and Hebrew texts, and a little bit of the Vulgate, and a little bit of Wycliffe's efforts in doing his English translation. So at that time, Tyndale said, well, let's use Erasmus's published Greek New Testament, and let's do English off of that. No one has done that before. So that was his big contribution. Tyndale, you'll find in a second, is the heavyweight in the entire history of the English Bible. The heavyweight. And we'll see why in a second. But he takes these old Greek and Hebrew texts, and that's the line. That's what he translates from. So and he only references the Vulgate when he tries to understand how Wycliffe did his English translation. So that's 1525, 1530. He starts it in 25. He gets parts of it done at different times, but it takes him 5 or 6 years. Tyndale had the same opinion that Wycliffe did. He said, if God spare my life ere many years, I will cause a boy that driveth the plow shall now know more of the scripture than thou doest. So that was actually an argument he had with one of his detractors. He said, if time allows, I'm going to translate the Bible, and a kid who drives a plow is going to know more about theology than you, buddy. That's what he's saying right here. So that was, again, expectedly very threatening to the clergy of the church, who had a lock on the Bible. You don't unlock the Bible to the laity. So Tyndale got in a ton of hot water. I should say, actually, hot logs, because he was burned at the stake. Yeah. That's how much hot water he got into. However, since he had the great respect of the religious community, they decided to do him a great kindness, and instead of having him go through the 3 or 4 days it takes to die from being burned at the stake, they would strangle him first as a courtesy, which is why when you see this picture, he's tied to that post and he's being strangled. That's because it's a wonderful thing. Because actually when you're burned at the stake, it takes about 3 days to die. Yeah, it's just a horrible thing. So they said, well, we burn you at the stake. It's a public thing. It tells everyone, don't go here. And it was like a crucifixion in a sense. But we don't want you to go 3 days into that agony. So we'll strangle you first. We'll garrote you first. And then, then we'll burn your body. I don't know. Yeah. That's what a good friend does. Yeah, strangle you first. But that's the kind of hot water he's in. By the way, the era right here in England is, you remember King Henry VIII? Henry VIII? This is Henry VIII. Henry VIII's son. Yeah, in fact, this is about the time of Anne Boleyn being killed. So it's during that. And remember, Henry also decided to annul his marriage as he needed to separate from the Catholic Church. So you got all that craziness going on at the time. So there's a lot of clergy craziness going on because Henry's separating from the Catholic Church. Clergy are fighting against each other. And then here comes this Tyndale guy, and he's doing this English Bible. That's wrong. Let's burn him. Let's burn him at the stake. So it was a very volatile time. This whole thing. This is exactly right in the middle of Henry VIII, is what it is. But interestingly enough, even though he's killed in 1536, he's jailed for 5 or 6 years. Still, this guy Coverdale, who worked with him, published a Bible a year before Tyndale was killed, which actually enjoyed great circulation in England. So why did they kill Tyndale and not Coverdale? Well, because Tyndale was kind of the mastermind behind the English translation, and Coverdale pretty much picked up the pieces of what Tyndale had done but had not published yet, and then completed a publishing of a Bible. So it had wide circulation. So a year before Tyndale was killed for being the mastermind of the English translation, Coverdale's out there spreading around like crazy. So it had some amount of acceptance. I mean, the Crown and the Church didn't really oppose it, hardly. I mean, it was still is not hugely above board, but still it had a huge circulation. But Coverdale, the Coverdale Bible, we call it, that was published right here. The Coverdale Bible is Tyndale's work with a little bit of massaging by Coverdale. Tyndale actually only finished the New Testament and I think the Pentateuch in the Old Testament. He didn't get the entire Bible done, although, and in terms of publishing, and then the rest of the Bible he had worked on and almost completed. Coverdale kind of tidied it up and then finished it and published it. So that's what he did. But it's a year before Tyndale's killed. So actually in 1535, Tyndale's in jail under a death sentence. And Coverdale's Bible, which is actually Tyndale's Bible, is going around. As long as it doesn't have Tyndale's name on it, they let it go around because Tyndale is a devil. He was the one behind it. So, and then another guy does a similar thing after that. By the way, see, I show Coverdale, his entire support is really on Tyndale's translation, and that's totally right. He just basically massaged Tyndale's work. Another guy that does the same thing is Matthew's Bible, and this is a year after Tyndale dies. So both Coverdale and Matthew were co-workers with Tyndale, kind of, what do you want to call them, like mentor-mentees as well. So Matthew's Bible comes out. It's actually not written by a guy named Matthews. It's written by a guy named John Rogers because he needs an alias. He needs a pen name. So the pen name he chooses is Thomas Matthew, who's nobody. It's just a pen name. So because Tyndale now just got killed, and he figures, well, if I'm going to do a massaged version of Coverdale and Tyndale's work, I need to do it under someone else's name. If we say this is Tyndale's work, it'll get burned. So I'll just call it the work of Thomas Matthews. Yeah, who's that? We don't know. Let's arrest him. I can't find him. So that's what this Matthew Bible is. It still is really Tyndale's work with like 95% Tyndale, 5% John Rogers' work in terms of compilation. A little bit of Coverdale is in that. But when you read the Matthew's Bible, especially the front page, the title page, we think it secretly gives credit to Tyndale, but you can't say it out loud or else you'll get burned at the stake. And how? Well, if you look at, there's initials in the front, Thomas Matthew, TM, okay, Tom Matthews. If you turn that over, it looks like WT, which is William Tyndale. Sorta. It's highly speculative, but a lot of people think, why did he pick the name Tom Matthews? Well, can you flip it over? It looks like William Tyndale. I don't know. So anyway, so it gives you an idea how volatile the times were. Rogers himself could have gotten killed for doing this, but they didn't know Rogers had a hand in it. In fact, they weren't sure Rogers had a hand in it until about 100, 200 years later. So, yeah, pretty interesting. That's how volatile it was at the time. Okay, so then after the Matthew's Bible, you have the Great Bible. This was actually authorized by Henry VIII, and it was put in every church. Just 3 years after Tyndale is killed. So a lot of the volatility has changed. But now, by this time for Henry VIII, he has basically, told the Catholic Church to take a hike. He's established the Church of England. And so this is part of his way of sort of stick it in the face of the Pope by coming up with a Protestant Bible, not Latin, a Protestant English Bible that was going to be deliberately placed in what used to be all the Catholic churches. Now it's Church of England churches. So it was a way of basically displacing the Latin Vulgate and the influence of the Catholic Church. So we'll make our own English Bible, and we'll deliberately place it in every church as a sign of kind of protest against the Pope. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And actually the separation is in process right now while all these things are happening. Yeah, exactly. There is, though, some of the clergy from the Catholic Church did switch to Church of England, and they had the same ego problems about being, preferred readers of the Bible. So there was animosity whether you're allied with the Catholics or with the Church of England now. But Henry decided to really stick it in the face of the Pope by putting these Bibles in front prominently. You know how you go in churches now, there'll be a table, an altar in front, there'll be a big Bible? That was the Great Bible. That was the in-your-face translation against the Pope. Well, the Catholic churches became Church of England churches, the buildings. Yeah, some stayed Catholic, but not many. And they didn't get these Bibles. Only the rebellious Church of England churches got them, which is most of them.
Jim, I got a question.
Yeah, quick.
I know this sounds kind of odd, but thinking about the Bible, do courtrooms usually carry a Bible, or was that way back?
Do courtrooms carry Bibles? They used to. I don't think they do anymore. Do you know, Betsy, when you place your hand on the Bible and swear? I don't think so.
The court that I went to didn't.
Yeah.
I'm just saying in certain states did they do.
They might. They used to historically. Yeah.
Jim, the only difference between the Church of England and the Catholic Church in the 1500s was one recognized the Pope as
That's
the
it.
leader.
That's
The
it.
other one didn't.
And the other recognized Henry as the leader. Henry was the leader of the
King of England.
Yeah. Yeah. So he
But
became
in both cases, the head of the church was also the head of the state.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. There was no separation of church and state. which that memory of this is which is why it went into our Constitution. So, church and church, yeah, right. Okay, so the Great Bible is there. And again, it is largely Tyndale's translation with a little bit of Matthew's compilation. The Great Bible, in terms of the wordage, is almost the same. The Great Bible didn't exist because they had access to new Greek documents at all. They're still using the same Greek documents Tyndale used. So it's the same legacy of that. But because it wasn't named after these guys, Henry says, "Great," and we'll stick in the churches. It was quite a political move, but it was a big deal in the churches of the time, because when Henry was trying to sell the separation from the Catholic Church, he was selling it to the populace on the basis that this is now the accessible church. You can access God, and we're going to prove that and show you that pictorially by giving you an English translation that we put right up in front of every church, and anybody can walk up to the front of the church and read it in their own language if you're literate. So that was a really, really big deal. So you could walk into a church at the time, in front what used to be a whole bunch of stuff that the priests would use. Now you've got in front, instead of all the paraphernalia the priests had in front, now you've got an open Bible sitting in the front, and anyone can walk up there and read it. Pictures? Actually, it was illustrated. It had some pictures, but not many. Yeah. So that was the Great Bible. And then after that, the Geneva Bible, named in Geneva only because the atmosphere was still pretty hostile in England, so they had to go to Geneva to have it printed. Well, wait a second. I thought Henry said it was put the Great Bibles around. Yeah, but it was still a gigantic fight. What Henry did started basically a religious civil war in England, and it was still going on. So Christians who wanted to do other translations had to go outside of the country to do it. There was a huge Christian community in Geneva that was English Christians, and it was in that community that they did the Geneva Bible in 1560. just 20 years after the Great Bible. But the Geneva Bible was an astonishing uptick in the English Bible. The translation itself is pretty much what the Great Bible was, a little bit of Matthew's, and through the Great Bible, Tyndale. It's still pretty much Tyndale's translation. Pretty much. There's no other old documents they're using. But what Geneva did, which was really cool, it's the first study Bible. So what they did was they took a lot of the doctrine that came out of the Reformation and they wrote it into the margins of the Geneva Bible. It was a study Bible. So when you looked at that, you could actually understand with someone telling you what the doctrine was based on what passages. And so the Geneva Bible wasn't meant to just be a showpiece in the front of churches. It was meant to be the Bible you took home. And it was the first time that happened. So here's what it was. It was expressly for families. It was in small type, so it wasn't the size of a refrigerator like the ones that they had, the Great Bible. It was for families in small type, relatively speaking. First time verses were shown as paragraphs, which is what we do today. We show a verse as a paragraph. And also the first time they used italics, this is interesting. If you have a King James Bible, they still do this today. A word in English that's italicized in the English means that this word does not have a Greek or Hebrew counterpart in the original document. It's added just to make the sentence readable. That's what it is. When Joseph Smith came along and changed the Bible, he decided to fix all the italicized things. So he largely took the italicized words out or retranslated them. He figured that was a good place to do some contribution. So he did a lot. But that's what the italics were. That was Geneva. So Geneva Bible in English, you could read it and you could tell which words didn't show up in the original text. The rest of the words in regular text were in the original text. So it was as though you were reading the old languages with the italics cluing you in for the extra words that were used just for readability. It's really a brilliant thing. And that was preserved in the King James as a tradition too. So Geneva did a ton of stuff. Geneva is also, that's the Bible that Shakespeare quoted out of. That's the one that came to Jamestown. That's the one that came to the Mayflower. Geneva Bible. Geneva was huge. It was huge. Gigantic. And it had the Reformation commentary in the margins. So it was really, if you look back in the history of English translations, it is probably the high watermark of all English translations. It was really way cool. They did some neat stuff. And it was pervasive. It went everywhere. And they made more copies than the Great Bible or any of them before that because they went into households and they said, look, not only is the Bible part of what you see on Sunday morning, but you can read the Bible by the fireside at home. That was what the Geneva Bible did. Just huge. Personal Bibles never existed before that. They were artifacts of the church. Now, you could take them home. Pretty cool. Geneva was an astonishing step forward. And then you get the Bishop's Bible after that. The clergy in the New Church of England still were a little irritated by some aspects of the doctrine of the Reformation. Now, they shouldn't be, because the Reformation, which happened in England as well as in Germany, a lot of places. But certain topics of the Reformation doctrine kind of irritated the Church of England priests even still. So they said, what do you say we make a Bible that doesn't have all the Reformation commentary in the notes? So they stripped out all the marginal notes in the Geneva Bible. It's hilarious. And then they just made their Bishop's Bible and went back to saying these are the Bibles we're going to put in the church. So they wanted a replacement church Bible in the front that was going to replace the great Bibles. The Geneva Bible was wildly popular, so they just decided, let's make it the Geneva Bible and strip out the commentaries in the sides. So that was the Bishop. It was well titled. It's the Bishop's Bible. They like that better. And then you have 1611. Now look at the time span from the bishops in Geneva. Not very long, actually. Maybe 40 years, and King James comes along. Poorly titled. James is kind of a jerk. I don't know if you know much about English history, and you talk to someone who's actually English about James the First of England. Yeah, they'll spit on the floor, and they hate the idea that we Americans call it the King James Bible. They say no, it's the authorized Bible. However, James never really authorized it necessarily. He started the translation as a monarch. He said, let's do this. And the only thing that James contributed was no marginal notes. That's probably the best thing that he did. We're going to do another translation, but no marginal notes, just like the Bishop's Bible, not like Geneva Bible, but let's do that. And he decided to establish his group of people to do it. 48 scholars. And the idea was, this is kind of cool, was to have 48 scholars, put them in 3 different locations, different college locations, university locations. And then we will assign the 3 groups of the 48 scholars different sections of the Bible to translate. Okay, they'll be completely independent, totally independent. And then when they finish their translation, they'll send it around to the other 2 groups for them to vet it and make sure it's okay. So everyone had their own section they had to do, but then everyone vetted each other. And since they were in 3 different locations, there wasn't the university politics, So it was actually a really great way of doing things. And they even worked in subgroups, I think, of 8 or 6 when they would do the translation. So in terms of a broad effort, this isn't the effort of one man. This is the effort of 48 people in 3 different university locations who cross-checked each other's work. It was a good way to do it. So that's King James. Still, King James does not have access to any better manuscripts. It's pretty much, there's actually 1 or 2, and I can't say that totally. There's 1 or 2 that come to light. But the King James and the scholars, what they did was they took all the English translations of the time, the Bishop and the Great and the Geneva. I don't think they had access to Tyndale, but it didn't matter because, Tyndale's in all the English translations. And they took all those different English translations and they would look at the different words that were used, and they did have access to Erasmus's 1522 Greek New Testament. So they had that. So they would take that published Greek New Testament and they would look at the English translations and they would just rediscuss again which English words best fit. And you'd think, well, that's kind of a waste of time. But actually not, because by the time you get to 1611, scholarship on Latin, scholarship on Latin, Greek, and Hebrew has gotten a lot better. They don't have necessarily any more documents, but their understanding of the original languages is much, much better. They've been reading a lot of classic Greek now for a couple hundred years, and their understanding of the nuances of the Greek words, and hence the best English word. So they really had a better understanding of the original languages and could better choose a word in English. So it was a good contribution. However, when you get done with that translation of the King James and you compare it to Tyndale's original English, you find that 80% of Tyndale's words are in the King James. 80%. That's how dominant Tyndale was. He's the culprit in this entire thing, because he coined phrases in a twinkling of the eye. That's Tyndale. That's a pretty handy way of saying that. You could have said something much more pedantic, like, well, in a brief second that takes longer, because twinkling isn't in there. It's just like, it just means brief. You could have something much more dry. But when you see Tyndale's English, it's pretty snazzy English, and there's a lot of places like that where Tyndale's language in the English is so perky, so snazzy, so kind of neat in that sense, that all the subsequent English translations, they'd look at that and say, man, we can't come up with anything better than that. That's pretty hot stuff, what Tyndale did. That's good. That's a great translation. That's perky. So when you get done with it, when you get to the King James guys pretty much agreed with 80% of what Tyndale had written and came through all those other translations. Said, I can't think of a better way to put that. That's great English. So as a result, King James is 80% the Tyndale Bible, because Tyndale was such a brilliant translator into English and came up with phrases that to this very day stick with how we translate things. Even today, if you come up with a modern translation in English, they'll reuse some of the perky language of Tyndale. That's just how good he was. He was really, really good. Actually, I did some more research on this 80%. There's been a handful of studies on this where they just kind of match the words to Tyndale's. And one study I read said it was 93%. 93% the words of Tyndale. So he was the dominant English translator. Dominant English translator. He's also not the only one that got killed for it. Coverdale got killed eventually. So, it was just a bad time politically to be doing this kind of stuff. People got killed for it because it was seen as heresy. Modern language Bibles, heresy. So that's how it was seen. Now, around this time, we've completely disconnected from the Catholic Church. This is really a Protestant line of the use of the Bibles. Is there a Catholic line of Bible translations into English? Well, yes. By the time you get to 1611, the Catholic Church says, well, we need an English translation too. We can't trust those Protestant ones because, after all, they got Reformation notes in the margins. That's anti-Pope. We can't do that. So we need our own English translation. So 1611, they finally bone up and they do something. This is the Protestant one. There is one over here. It's very popularly called the Douay-Rheims Bible, and because it was translated in two different places, two cities. The Old Testament translation was done in Douay, and it was finished in 1610. In the city of Rheims, they did the New Testament, and that was done in 1582. And then they finally put those together into one Bible around 1610, which is about the same time as King James Bible. So they saw the multi-year effort that the Church of England was doing, and they decided, we need to do that too. So we got to hop to it and finish the Old Testament so we can put it all together and say, no, this is the Bible. So they did the Douay-Rheims Bible. But what did they use as their source material for the Douay-Rheims in 1610? The Latin Vulgate. 100% the Latin Vulgate. They didn't look at any of the other stuff. So that's a Latin Vulgate translation in English. Still not bad. I mean, it's still an English translation that was starting to be used inside the Catholic Church, which itself is almost a blasphemy. You just don't do that in the Catholic Church. But they did. So there you've got Douay-Rheims. You'll see that title come up over and over again. To this day,
Still use that word?
no, they don't use it anymore. But when you talk to a Catholic about English translations, the same way we'll go back to King James, they'll go back to Douay-Rheims. That's just what they use.
Isn't that a little confusing?
It is, to me. Okay, we got to quit, but just to let you know where we're going next week. After King James reigned for a long time in English translations, but you notice King James all has its origins in the Textus Receptus, the 6 or 7 old manuscripts, not older than 900 AD. So it's very limited. But from the time of 1611 on, suddenly, especially when you get to the 19th century, a lot of these other documents in the blue start to come to light, which creates a controversy. Someone needs to take these new documents and see if they agree with what they did in 1611. And so the next English Bible that comes out is the Revised Version, which comes out in 1884. And the Revised Version was called Revised because it's supposed to just be a revision of the King James, a revision of the King James. But when they did the Revised Version, it wasn't based totally on the King James. It was mostly on the new manuscripts. And that is what's caused the kind of rift between the King James camp and everybody else, because now we have another 5,000 to 6,000 documents that inform the Revised Version that they didn't have for that entire stream up until then, which is just half a dozen. So that's really how it changes. And then from that point on, the Revised Version, and we'll look at that next time, modern translations of English, the Revised Version goes on to subsequent revisions that are informed by more and more availability to really old documents. So that's what's really different. The King James stays just with this Textus Receptus, and actually so does the New King James, and they'll claim that small subset of documents in the bottom, the TR, the Textus Receptus, is actually superior, spiritually speaking, from the rest of them that get discovered. Then there's no rationale for that, but that's kind of what the thing is. It's more like if those 6 documents were good enough for the King James Bible and for William Tyndale, who is an English translation stud, then it's good enough for us. So that's kind of where that goes. So next week we'll look at the history after this point, Revised Version, and we'll take it all the way up to the present and use it so you can kind of figure out why it is that we have so many English translations and what are the advantages of them and why we have so many. Is that right or wrong? Is it because we still disagree about what should be in Bible? No. The translations just have different purposes. So we'll look at that next time. So that'll be the end of the line with English translations. So.